Turn the headphones up.
Hey, oh,
Yeah. Well, I guess you can call me a dreamer,
hey,
but I do believe
oh,
that things will change.
oh,
We've been through the storm.
yeah,
We've gone through the valley.
oh,
There's nowhere else to go but up.
we shall overcome.
We will
We shall
overcome.
overcome.
Yeah.
We shall overcome. Someday.
Now, if you believe that, just help me sing it.
We shall overcome. We shall
overcome.
We shall overcome.
We should overcome racism,
We shall overcome.
hatred,
Someday.
jealousy. Now, even if you don't believe it, help me say this.
We'll walk hand in hand.
I believe that.
We'll walk hand in hand.
I already see it.
We'll walk hand in hand.
Yeah.
Someday.
See, it don't matter what color you are or where you come from.
We'll walk hand in hand.
You're my brother.
We'll walk hand in hand.
You're my sister, my friend.
We'll walk hand in hand.
Yeah.
Someday.
I really like this part right here. Freedom.
We will all be free. We will all be free. We will all be free.
I believe it and I receive it today.
We will all be free.
Freedom.
Someday.
Now just help me say it one more time if you believe that. We will all be free.
We will all be free.
Free from our father's sins. Free from our own sins. Free from racism, from jealousy, from hatred.
We'll all be free.
Someday. Let's take it to the chorus. Oh, deep in my heart.
Deep in my heart.
I do believe
I do
that
we shall overcome.
yes,
Someday.
let it be today.
Deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. This is me, Faisal Kader again, on behalf of BEST, Bangladeshi Entrepreneurs Society of Talents. Welcome back, and today's show is a special show. As you know, that we talk about different, social issues and social environmental related topics with our next generation. So likewise, today we have another 6 highly talented individuals from our community, and we'll be talking about LGBTQ, which is a very important matter. And as you know, in the last few episodes, we talked about social unrest, we talked about presidential election, class of 2020, we talked about bullying, we talked about how we can cope with this pandemic situation. So this is nothing new, but this is a very timely and very important matter. And, as I was trying to kind of emphasize that, please, all the parents who are watching, bring your children, get them involved. This is a great platform to boost up your children, their leadership, and their networking. We can build a better and stronger community and the world together. And these are the leaders, whom you're going to be talking in the next hour or so. Super talented, highly brilliant individuals, and you'll be mesmerized. You'll be impressed by their intellect and whatnot. And I can't believe that this is our 10th episode. So in the last several months, we have been conducting this, and this has been, has been a tremendous, attention from the community, and they are enjoying it to the extreme. So without further ado, Let me bring our moderators, and then we're going to get started. First off, I want to bring Farhana Mo, and our second moderator, Zarafsha Zara. How are you, Mo?
I'm good. How are you?
Good, good. Hi,
10th
Zara.
episode. Congratulations.
I know this is the 10th show. I can't believe it. So anyway, this is a great topic. So I just don't want to take any of your time. This is your show. I'm just a coordinator here. So let me go backstage and you guys have a great time. And I can't wait to hear from all of you.
No, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you really
Thank you.
for letting this topic be discussed on the show. I think it's so important.
Yeah.
And I think, I mean, I want to ask, I know the second part of this show is always going to be the question and answer part. And we really encourage the audience to ask questions
Yes,
and
indeed.
make comments always. But, you know, this topic and this like discussion today is not coming from like a place of bad intention or disrespect or anger or anything. It's
Mm-hmm.
actually from the opposite, from a place of like love and care for the community. So when you're asking these questions and making these comments, we hope you respond in the right way and, you know, really think about the questions you're asking, about things that you're actually curious about, things that you don't understand, you want to understand. So kind of just listen to this discussion, like really listen with an open mind and most importantly an open heart. That's like all we're asking for you.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
Perfectly said. And I think just bring your family in.
Exactly.
Yes, it is. It is a discussion that is always a little bit of a difficult topic, but we're trying to make it the best, and definitely it's suitable for everyone in the family to watch.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, I'm gonna go to the backstage and you guys get started, and then I'll be back a little later. Have fun.
All right. Thank you. So, good afternoon, friends. Our 10th episode, unbelievable. It's been a whirlwind, since the time COVID-19 has struck. And we've just started thinking how we can just relax ourselves, talk about things. And now here it is, the 10th episode. Things have obviously, there's still a lot of cases outside, but we're trying. We're trying our level best to become used to this norm life. Um, so again, I am Farhana Zaman Mo, your co-host would be Zaraf Shah Ahmed as well, who would be presenting the open discussion later in the show. If you are new to Best Talks, what Best Talks has been doing is it has created this platform, and we've been inviting talented individuals to own this virtual stage, raise awareness, and discuss issues that would impact all of our lives. This week, we choose to talk about the LGBTQ community. We just have not had time, or there's just been so many pressing issues that we've not come here, but we've started to talk more about all other issues that are still not gone while COVID-19 is still in effect. So LGBTQ, in definition, it's lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer, which all includes other individuals as well, like asexual, intersex, and non-binary. This has been a very stigmatized subject historically, but over time, this topic has brought together a community so strong and has gained many important civil rights and legal recognition. They're still humans in flesh, able to love, have careers and families, as everyone else. Then what is the problem? What is that makes them different from us, especially in the South Asian communities? Why are they different? Or are they made to feel different by social norms and cultural treatment? So, without further ado, this is something that we want to discuss ahead today with our panelists. And thank you so much for coming to the show today. It means a lot because it's not an easy topic. There's way too many shades of gray rather than black and white. So I'm sure this is not easy for you as well. And so thank you for being so brave, coming to the show and sharing your opinions with us. I will be introducing our panelists first. We have Aditi Chaudhary today, Jack Sadat, Sri Sinha, Tanya Chatterjee, Shaila Hassan, and Samara Hassan. Thank you again, and very good afternoon to you guys. So, I want to begin the show, and my first question is for Aditi. So, Aditi, welcome back to the show. For those who haven't watched your previous episode, I just wanted to let know that Aditi has been working as an administrative assistant in Loudoun County Public Schools and will be completing her Master's of Education in School Counseling from George Mason University this December. Aditi, you also mentioned that one of the reasons that you took up school counseling was to help engage, empower, and advocate for the younger generations in America. And I think, we're just proud to have you here today because this is exactly what BEST is trying to achieve. So, Aditi, is this whole LGBTQ a Western phenomena? As in, and also I wanted to know that sometimes the South Asian community just thinks that this is only existent of all the Western countries in the world. So, what do you think about that?
Is this a Western phenomenon? Absolutely not. There are people who identify as queer everywhere in the world, in every country. And when I say queer, I'm using queer as an umbrella term to describe those who reject the binary categories of sexual orientation and/or gender to express who they are. So that's anybody that falls outside of the masculine, feminine, heterosexual norm, right? Your friends, your neighbors, your teachers, your children, any of these people in your lives could identify as queer. You just may not know it or be aware of it. The fact that there's this myth in South Asian culture that identifying as queer is a Western phenomenon actually shows how we've been influenced by colonialism and Western influences. Homosexual culture is seen in our roots. Some of the most ancient pieces of literature in South Asian culture, such as the Kama Sutra, the Tamil Sangam literature, they include content on homosexual behavior and homosexual relationships, as well as transgender women and men. Even in Islamic history, Sultan Mahmud of Ghazni was the first Muslim ruler of the Indian subcontinent. He had a relationship with his slave, Malik Ayaz, who he later appointed as the Sultan of Lahore. The son of Alauddin Khajil, who was the ruler of the Delhi Sultanate from 1296 to 1316. He was in a relationship with one of the noblemen in his father's court. From an Indian mythological perspective, transgender individuals were seen and considered as gods and goddesses. They were great poets, artists, and even administrators in medieval times. There's one historian, Rana Safsi, who said that love was celebrated in India in every form. So whether in ancient or medieval India, fluid sexuality was present and accepted in society. It wasn't until 1858 when the British brought their own rules into India, including Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, which criminalized homosexual behavior. And it wasn't until then that our ideals of fluid sexuality were suppressed. So this law was enforced by the British and their Christian belief systems, which did not conform with India's attitude towards homosexuality. So these conservative outlooks about homosexuality started with the British rule and then strengthened after many of our South Asian nations gained independence. Section 377 wasn't even ruled out in India until 2018. That means gay sex was illegal until just a couple of years ago. And some historians believe that this rule stayed in India or stayed in place because of India's ignorance of their history as well as the apathy of politicians. So centering back to our present time, these conservative attitudes have developed into homophobia and transphobia in our South Asian culture, meaning that there's a fear and unacceptance of those who don't identify as a straight man or woman. But how have we as humans allowed that to turn into violence? Gulhaz Manan, who was the founder of Bangladesh's only LGBTQ rights magazine, and he was a prominent activist. He was murdered in 2016 in Dhaka after he came out as an open gay man. And his perpetrators were heard chanting Allahu Akbar after they left the scene. Sarah Higazi was an Egyptian lesbian woman and activist who was arrested and tortured in Egypt after waving a rainbow flag at a concert. and she just committed suicide last month after seeking asylum in Canada. Some reactions to her death on Instagram included comments saying that she deserved it and that Allah wouldn't grant her peace or forgive her in heaven. In America, many Black trans women and lives have been taken as well, silently, without getting much attention to what's really happening. So although in America, same-sex marriage was made legal in 2015, we have a long, long way to go in terms of our attitudes and our South Asian culture. And these efforts must start locally. Peace and acceptance within your family will bleed into the community and then hopefully expand from there.
You know, I got stuck there where you said about family, because I think one of the most common problems, even before you come out to other people, your community, is when you come out to your family. And I think it's basically, you know, an open concern, like someone telling you within your family, "Je, lokera ki bolbe." You're a weirdo in this family. What are you just thinking about? We're not like this, people. Me and your mom is completely fine. So what's wrong with you? I mean, how much do you think that is the community responsible or your family responsible? I think, of course, the responsibility is everyone's. But, you know, these first questions, how much impact do they have on you, on being a homophobic compared to the community? Like, do you actually think they're even more responsible when they come up with these dialogues when the kid or, you know, an adult opens up to their family first? Because we often say go to the family before you reach out to other people.
Yeah, I think everything is rooted in exposure. You know, many of our parents, many of the generations before ours were not exposed to people who identified outside of the heterosexual norm. So maybe our parents or maybe generations before us didn't think that these people existed, or they weren't exposed to the way that people lived outside of this norm, right? So that directly affects how our generations are experiencing life here in the United States, where maybe now things are more acceptable, right? And so parents think that these are Western ideals when in fact, everything is rooted in our culture, but it's kind of like a full cycle. We're coming back to where we naturally were, right? Humans naturally and experienced and expressed love in many different ways and forms. So now with families deeming things unacceptable just because they haven't been exposed to it, just because it's something that they don't know. Unknown things are uncharted territory, right? When you don't know something, you tend to fear it. So that is directly impacting how easy or difficult it is for somebody in a family to express their true identity to them.
True that. And I think our culture has a deep-rooted lokera ki bolbe problem. I guess if we can move out of that, it is one thing to be accepted by the community, but it's more important to be actually accepted by the family first. So, and you're right, it's not a Western phenomena. So I guess it's this flow that should take place, that it's still there in our culture. We're just not used to it, and we need to uproot some, things like social I would say social norms, that you can talk to a kid saying that you're a weirdo in the family. Thank you, Aditi. So my next question is for Jack. Jack, you're currently you're a senior year student at North Dakota State University, majoring in history and economics minor. I've also learned from reading your bio that you have been interested in pursuing internships in advocacy groups. I mean, I would think that is because you do want to help and spread the message, raise awareness, which is amazing. And I guess you're also, we're just so happy that you're here today, because that's exactly what we're trying to do through these, through talking about this very sensitive issue. So, Jack, like 20 years before, LGBTQ was a very hush topic, as in we obviously would not be thinking about coming out loud and discussing, especially for the reasons that Aditi mentioned earlier, that it hasn't been easy. People have been aggressively targeting you, telling you don't deserve to be part of this place. So, but until date also, even though we do understand that there is an LGBTQ community existing, we don't really fully understand who these people are, what is different about them, or why are they even identified differently, why they should be part of another community. So I would like to understand from you, what is the difference between gender identity, and sexual orientation?
Okay, so one thing to understand before I go into what gender identity is we need to understand the difference between sex as assigned at birth by doctors and by society and what gender identity is. So sex is something that is normally determined by doctors when you're born based on usually genitalia, most conspicuously, other times by secondary sex characteristics such as, developing with an Adam's apple, your, body fat distribution, having breasts, and so forth. And it's important to understand that this is sort of a bimodal model where most people will fall on the male or female classification. But there are also those people who actually don't conform to this, not by choice, they're intersex. That's just how they developed. They don't fall into that role in society. So sex is something that is a physical classification, not a component of who someone is. And for most people, their gender identity aligns with their sex, and that's why it's kind of harder for them to understand the difference. But gender identity is your personal conception of yourself as a man, a woman, non-binary, maybe no gender at all. It's something that's very personal. It's not a choice. It's just, I guess, a facet of your identity that's completely inherent to yourself. For a lot of people, it's very straightforward. For me, I'm a man. I identify as a man. That's just who I am. I'm not referred to as anything else. It's not something that's ever been confusing to me. Whereas for other people, maybe they're non-binary, maybe they understand that they're neither a man or a woman and they're straightforward on that, or maybe they're confused. Maybe they don't understand where they fall on this. It's something that's a very personal relationship. And I think in order to understand gender identity, we need to understand that it's not always an easy question for some people. So when we move that topic into the difference with sexual orientation, we understand that gender identity is completely just ourselves. It's our identity. Sexual orientation relates to how we relate with other people. It's who we are attracted to. For example, if you are gay, you are attracted to someone who is the same gender as you. If you are heterosexual, the opposite gender. Or you could be bisexual, attracted to all genders, or asexual with no sexual attraction. It varies, but just the main difference is that it's your personal identity, gender identity, versus your attraction to other people, which is sexual orientation.
Thank you, and that's really nicely put. And then, when you mentioned that it's sometimes very easy for someone to know that, okay, because this is how I look, this is who I am. And when this confusion arises about gender identity, like, what do you think is what hits them the most? Because I know that they're confused, that I look like a man, I should be in love with a woman, and I am a man. But when this gender identity crisis, I think this is more personal to that person. And when it's attacking them, saying that no, this is not what we're accepting you as. I mean, have you heard of a story, or have you heard of a friend who has been confused and they don't even know how to respond to the self-conscious? Like, how difficult it has been for anyone to respond to that kind of self-conscious, voices or whatever words in their head.
So you mean dealing with like personal struggles of identity?
Yeah. And I mean, I also think that sometimes, people come to say that you're just not listening right. You're not talking right. I mean, there's always going to be other voices, in your head as well, who would say, no, you're not, although they strongly feel. I mean, is this struggle, I understand it's not easy for everybody to get through this struggle and get past to what they really are. So, I mean, have you heard of someone who's gone through such a struggle? Or, what do you think? Like, how difficult is it to listen to these voices in your head?
Oh, absolutely. I used to run a gay straight alliance at my high school just for the sake of like having a safe place where a lot of kids could come together, because, it was a North Dakota high school. So, tending very conservative. So people weren't really open to different experiences. So I had that group there, and there were lots of kids, that, had trouble figuring out where they fit in life, not just because of, being unsure about their own identity, but because they didn't really have people who were receptive to helping them figure out their identity. Mm-hmm. So that's something more muddled, because When your environment isn't supportive of you, that makes you more conflicted and more unsure of something that you may have been more sure about previously. And it's also just the need to feel like you're fitting yourself into a correct category when, you know, maybe there isn't a category for you. But in society, it almost requires in, you know, standard everyday society that you have a category that you fit yourself into. So that's where a lot of the conflict comes from, is trying to fit such complexity into such neat little boxes.
Yes. That's a very pretty way of saying it, putting it in a neat little box. Shaila, I think you wanted to go next, chime in with Jack.
Yes, so to talk about the topic of gender identity and whether we know people who have gone through these personal crises, I've seen friends who have, you know, once they have the independence, once they go to college and they're exposed to more, they realize that what they've always felt is off with them is something that they can address, and they can express themselves as who they feel that they truly are. And there's so much suffering and stigma that goes along with this experience, that the idea that anyone would do it for attention or for a whim, for something they hadn't truly thought about and committed to, with deep introspection and consideration of the consequences, that's very dismissive for people to say, like, oh, it's just a phase. Nobody goes through intense bullying and stigma for a phase, and no one should have to, whether it is or not. We should be free to question. And I think a good role for us to kind of explore is, like, in the Dutchy community now, you know, many of us here are women who maybe a generation or two ago wouldn't be in our careers, in our academic positions, because of gender roles. So we've made so much progress as a community, and we see the positive impacts of removing those restrictions based on gender, right? But we still hold on to a couple of holdovers, like, you know, like bachadero. Like, if you're a girl, you're gonna end up cooking, and you have to like pink and princesses. And, you know, we talk about this in Western society as well, and we're slowly combating this, but we need to talk about how it manifests in our own homes. You know, are you asking your son to help out around the house as much as women, or do you feel that it's for some reason not his responsibility? How do these things factor in? And, you know, I'm not just attacking guys here. There's also things that women are not permitted to do, or men are expected to do. You know, something athletic, something strong. Even in subtle ways, these shape how a generation can force an identity on a child. So then when your kid says, I don't think this is me, it's unfair to not think about, have I tried to force an identity on my child that I'm now saying, no, you're a girl. I mean, you're a girl. We know because we raised you as a girl, right? I think these are kind of, they seem just like small things, but they really do build into kind of that crisis of identity and that self, you know, consideration of, you know, are these things I really like, or are these things that were foisted upon me societally? And as you said, Mo, with the role of the family. So I think it's complex because that all ties into identity as we see it today.
Right, and I see a lot of affirmative smiles to some things that you said. So I think even I wouldn't go further with it, but I think Tanya, she wanted to add a point to what you said. Yes, Tanya.
Yes. So, you know, kind of going along the lines of what everyone has said already, you know, something that Aditi mentioned is your community, your exposure, and like, you know, sometimes our machis and meshos saying, "Amader time eshab chilo na," right? And so you grow up thinking that, you know, that, wait a minute, like, am I weird? Am I different? Like, I'm having these feelings, you know, this attraction. And teenagers, you have hormones, it's hard as it is. And then you're like, wait, you know, are my thoughts different than like my best friend's thoughts, right? So you have that. But I think about, you know, finding the words to describe who you are, right? So we talk about LGBTQ plus, right? So I think people are pretty familiar with those first five. And then you have, you know, and some people say, oh, every day there's a new letter. It's so hard to keep up. There's asexual, bisexual, demisexual, blah, blah, blah. But I like to think about it as like how freeing it can be for me or anybody else in the world to find that word that describes you, when for this entire time you may have been thinking like, you know, there's no one like me out there. I don't have a community, right? There's so many things. And then you find that, you know, whether it's a queer community as a whole, right? And, you know, we don't want to put people in boxes, but sometimes it's really nice to find the word or that box that you kind of fit into, that you can kind of identify with, right? Because that means that you have some kind of support out there for yourself. So
Yeah, and I think that's a lot of good information out there. Just even to tell our viewers, um, if you can't define yourself, I guess it's fine, right? We can still move on and say we're different. And that's the whole point of this conversation, that it's a struggle. We know someone who's struggling is struggling bad. And and it might not end soon because you might not have an answer. You want to be in a box, but it's okay to be different. All right. Thank you, Jack. And thank you, Tanya and Shaila, for chiming in. My next question is for Sri. Hi, Sri. So, Sri, you are a doctoral candidate in counseling psychology at the University of Denver. Your clinical work and research focuses mainly on multicultural counseling and romantic relationships, focusing on queer people of color. You're also the founder of SASMA, the South Asian Sexual and Mental Health Allowance, along with Tanya, who's going to be a next panelist as well. And you identify members of the LGBTQ community. You identify as a member of the LGBT community. So, Sri, I was doing some research, actually in a broader perspective about, what identity crisis means to kids who identify themselves in the LGBTQ community. So, based on that research, these kids struggle with racial and especially around ethnic and racial minorities. So, does it seem that being part of the community is something you become or something that you're born with? And essentially, what does identity mean in relation to being part of the LGBTQ community?
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to give a big shout out to Aditi and Jack for starting this off in such a beautiful, eloquent way, and really, I think, speaking truth to power in terms of the struggles that whether we ourselves identify as members of the LGBTQ community or have friends and loved ones and feel ourselves as allied with that community. So thank you for bringing this topic up, and Faisal Uncle for bringing it together. So in terms of identity, I do love talking about this because, as you mentioned, this is both something that I study, that this is what I'm getting my PhD in, this is what, as I'm training as a psychologist, what I focus on in terms of my therapy and my clinical work. And I identify as a member of the queer community myself. So it is very much something that is both professionally what I've dedicated my life to, as well as something personally that I have grappled with throughout my own identity development, and being a Bengali woman, and really kind of bringing those worlds together. So I'll give you the answer first, more so from kind of the research or clinical or academic side. And that is to say that identity development is a struggle for all people in terms of, coming to terms with right? And that's kind of what this whole series is about, is helping millennials, Gen Z, families overall to kind of frame these conversations and get some more exposure and ideas about what's happening in the world. What are my values? Where do I fit in, etc. And I think anybody, everybody in their process of growing, as a teenager, that's kind of the common time where you go through those identity struggles, and trying to figure out who am I, separate from my parents or outside of what I've been exposed to. And then often, in our 20s, in our 30s, it's a continuous process, right? So if you think about that, that's really no different from being a queer kid or a trans kid who's going through that same identity development. And again, all of us here are Basi, right? So all of us as brown people, especially brown people growing up in majority white spaces or a white majority country, regardless of who you see around you, those values are embedded. And so you naturally have this struggle of saying, okay, I got made fun of for the bhat and dal that I brought to lunch, right? And
Right.
do I smell like curry, right? Because people are telling me that. Those same things that I think anyone here can relate to, it's the same thing, being queer or trans. Just because it's a different identity vector, right? A different box, as we were talking about, the process is genuinely the same. And so I think that piece of when you're asking, is it something that you're born with or something that you become? That's a classic nature versus nurture question. And the answer is it's a little bit of both. There's not clear, there is evidence on both sides. And there's not like one clear winner, meaning that there are some genetic predispositions that we're aware of. And especially kind of in the notion that it's a choice is false, because this is in the same way that I cannot change the color of my skin. As much as I, may think my life would be easier if I was white, I'm just not. And that's just a frank reality. And the same way as my life would be a lot easier if I was straight, but I'm not. And that's just the reality. So it is identity development and that process of coming to terms with that. I mean, there's so many identity development models that I could share with you. And if folks are interested, as you all have mentioned, so Tanya and myself, along with two other great folks, we have started an organization, been around for about 5 years now. We'll talk a little bit more about it during the break, but SESMA this is exactly what we focus on, is LGBTQ identity, sexuality, sexual health, and mental health for South Asian American kids. So there's a lot of information out there, but I think the biggest thing to keep in mind is that even though the behavior or interest or attraction is just inherent, in the same way that, like, I wish I was taller, but I will never be taller, right? It's just things that it is what it is. So the qualities are inherent, but I think the piece of the identity, like struggling with it, coming to understand it, that is based off of your culture and your community and your surroundings, right? The norms, like we were talking about, family acceptance, what you see in the media, how much of yourself is represented, all of those things. So the answer is it's a little bit of both. And just like with any other identity that we try to make sense of and figure out for ourselves throughout the course of our lives, being LGBTQ, being queer, trans, gender nonconforming is the same exact thing. It's no different because we're all humans at the end of the day. It's just this one little thing that's like, most other people don't do this one specific thing. So just like, most people love coffee, I love tea, whatever it might be. It's just, it is what it is. We're still all people.
And I just wanted to raise that because you put up a very, very good point that oftentimes people think there is a choice to be someone else. But you said it so beautifully that this is not a choice. This is what you personally feel, and you have to go by it. Otherwise, you're going to lose your mental strength. So that's a very good point out there that, it's not choice is what we think it is. We can be black, or we can be brown and then just become white because we went in for a day. So that is a great point right there. And thank you, Sri, for your input here. Tanya, you're next. You're also another co-founder for SASMA along with Sri. So I want to go with the rest of the things that you're doing. You're doing quite a few things. Tanya, you're an HIV educator with the Innova Health System, and you have done your master's in reproductive and cancer biology from Johns Hopkins University. Already mentioned that you're a co-founder for SASMA, and you will be talking about it later on, more about it with us. But of course, before I jump to the question, I do want to know from both you and Sri, at least 2 lines about what is SASMA and what is the scope of it.
Sure. And I think, Sri covered some of the topics, and it's kind of in our title, right? Sexual and Mental Health Alliance. But I kind of look at it, and one of the things that we talk about is like, it's all the taboo topics in our society, South Asian culture. So, sexual health, there's also reproductive health, and it's not just about having babies or not having babies, like it's sex, there's pleasure, there's consent, there's healthy relationships. So that's there. And then in terms of mental health, right? And part of that is also growing up between 2 cultures, growing up between South Asian culture and American culture, and how we often have these conflicting expectations between what Ma and Baba are telling me and what my friends are telling me, or what my college roommate is telling me, right? And so balancing all of those things, finding a community that has similar experiences to you, and then kind of ultimately being able to balance both cultures, but not being bogged down with the expectations that's been put on you that often are pretty unrealistic and hard to deal with. So that's SASMA in a nutshell.
That's beautiful. And I'm sure, like, I haven't had a chance to really talk about it, but I'm sure there's some beautiful work happening right there. So coming back to the question, according to Human Rights Watch, almost 2.8 billion people are living in countries where identifying as gay could lead to imprisonment, corporal punishment, or even death. In stark contrast, only 780 million people are living in countries where same-sex marriages, civil or their civil unions are a legal right.
Mhm.
So I wanted to ask you that why, in your view, do you think homosexuality is criminalized in some nations versus other? Of course, we're talking about 2.8 billion people who are not happy,
Mhm.
which is a big number. So,
Absolutely.
and of course, talking, I also want to go back and relate to the fact that Aditi has very well, she's put it that it's been through generations and it's been through cultures embedded. So why is it still criminalized in some nations?
For sure. And I think there's no one right or wrong answer to this, but there are, I think, several things that I think we can all agree have happened and are happening that are contributing to it even now. And like Aditi said, it's ironic that in South Asian history, being LGBTQ, whether it was ever recognized as such or even being different than quote unquote normal, has always existed. So why are we criminalizing it now? Part of it is definitely colonialism. It has a huge part to play. It was in 1860 that the British actually started Section 377 as a law across the entire Indian subcontinent. And of course, at that time, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan were all India, right, before anything split. But it was literally put in place to protect their British men who were on the ground from the reaches of sodomy. Like I read a paper on it that was like, it's this tropical climate, people might get swayed and just start having sex with men. And it just, you think about like how crazy that sounds, right? Like, do what you gotta do. But that's literally why this law was put in place. And it was also to protect their Christian morals and their Christian values, to make sure that they weren't swayed by these like, exotic people and their exotic religion, which is to say, non-Christian, less than Christian, right? All those things, right? So it was very much to protect like their ideals and their Christianity and their beliefs and stuff like that. So that has definitely played a part. And unfortunately, in lots of different countries that, have now gained independence, and including South Asian countries, we are still grappling with the bad stuff that colonialism left us. And people are quick to be like, oh, colonialism gave us, our parliament and our railroad systems and this and that. But it also gave us like colorism and racism and all kinds of other things that honestly, I don't know how long it'll take for us to get rid of those things, right? But we're stuck with it and we're dealing with it. So Section 377 is very much a colonial vestige. It was overturned at some point, and then it came back actually, and then was finally overturned again in 2018. But and then in the United States, right, gay marriage was legalized in 2015. And I know Shayla is going to speak more to that, but that doesn't mean that discrimination doesn't exist, right? Just like we're talking about Black Lives Matters. Everyone is equal under the law, supposedly, but that's not actually what's happening. So it's the same thing, So we have that. And then I think part of it is also very much like religious and cultural influences and religious like fundamentalism and things like that, where you are very strict in your definition of what is right and what is wrong and how people that are wrong should be punished or whatever for not sticking to the norm. In our South Asian culture, I think a big part of it is definitely like the gender roles that were brought up, right? That women are expected to, and even though roles are changing, it's like, yeah, but you should still be the one who should know how to cook and clean, right? And you're supposed to make babies. That's one of the biggest things, right? You need to get married by a certain age so you can have children, and men can't have children. So so you have to marry a man to have a child, right? And so you are constantly reinforcing heteronormativity or heterosexuality, and that is the only real way to live and like have a family, and that's not the only way to have a family, right? So we ignore sex for pleasure, we ignore like just living free and not have like marriage is great, right? It's great if that's the thing for you, but it's not for everybody. And maybe I don't want to marry a man, so thinking about all those things and all those cultural expectations we put both on men and women, but I would say more so on women. I think women definitely face a lot of the brunt of it because, you know, a lot of times we're told like our clock is ticking, right? And like all the stuff. So yeah, I think it's a lot of different things.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, do you still think that, you know, when we're talking about, so a lot of times when we talk about these problems, we're saying that, okay, I feel personally, no, this shouldn't be the case. A man is the one who should be the breadwinner and the woman is running the house. So this is a personal belief for one person versus another. But when we talk about criminalization and that, you know, there is still countries that is focusing on that, is it because you think that even politically, or they sort of bring their own ideas to the table without really thinking of the community as a whole?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, laws and stuff are often very, you know, driven by personal politics, right? It's not necessarily for the good of the people or the good of the whole. I mean, we know this, right? And there's corruption everywhere. It's, you know, and I think there's a myth also that, oh, you know, India is so corrupt, or like South Asian countries are so corrupt, and, you know, but corruption is everywhere. You just may not be seeing it, you know, as overtly as you do maybe in India or something like that. But absolutely. I mean, what good does it do? Like in India, right? 377. Who cares who somebody's having sex with behind closed doors, right? Why would that put someone in jail? Why does it bother you so much that you have to create a freaking law around it, right? Like, just let people be. But it's not enough. You have to, it's all about, it comes down to like policing and like this narrative of morality. And again, what is right and what is
morality, right?
It's not, and morality, and we talked about, you said in the beginning, right? It's a gray area. There's no black and white, right? But it's ultimately what ends up happening. Laws are one person's morality. It's not everybody's morality. And so in the end, the people that are maybe marginalized more are the ones that end up getting punished. And that's the society we live in.
Yeah, and I mean, and also the reason that I asked you that question is because, you know, we're talking like statistics loudly, as loud as possible, says 2.8 billion people are impacted because they don't really have a law that talks for them. So I think even through our episode and with what you said today, I think that is a problem. Like, if one person in a government sector changes their mind to be, you know, looking less at them, what they believe versus what should be good for these 2.8 billion people, I think there would be countries who would be going for a change, at least in the way, you know, these people shouldn't be punished, at least for anything. So thank you, Tanya. That was very insightful. Thank you. Shaila, you're next. Again, welcome back as well. This is your second time with us, and I was so happy that you're here. For those of you, you know, who haven't probably watched Shaila's first episode, Shaila, you're currently working in national security after your graduation from the College of William and Mary in 2014. Your current role is in communications and public affairs. You hold a master's in public administration from George Mason University. So Shaila, you know, because Tanya was talking about criminalization and that if laws had changed, and she was talking about Section 377, I think we want to go around the same to talk about the positive side of it. There are countries who have changed these laws. You know, USA in 2015 had legalized gay marriages, and then again in 2018. You know, India had basically repealed Section 377. These are very positive changes to the LGBTQ community. I wanted to ask you, what do you think or perceive are the benefits from these changes to the LGBTQ community?
Thanks so much, Mo. And before we even get started on these benefits, I want to tack on yet another legal victory, which is that recently the Supreme Court, you know, determined that you cannot basically fire someone for being part of the LGBT community. While the implementation and enforcement of that is a lot harder than just saying, no, you can't. It's a very big step, but that's what we're doing right now. We're taking steps. You know, and that's the point, ideally, of a justice system, right? It's in the name. We, as Tanya kind of mentioned with policing, we lean so much towards using the justice system punitively that we kind of forget that it's for us to have rights. It's for us to make progress and for us to have an equitable society. And so I think, you know, making rights more accessible and universal, which should never have been in question in the first place, is a really, really big step. And, you know, we do want to celebrate these huge legal victories. It's not just symbolic, too. It's not a matter of It's not just same-sex couples saying, I want to go to a courthouse, I want to have a wedding. It's a matter of, you know, what rights come with marriage that we take for granted because it is both a legal and a social, sometimes religious union. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple minutes. But under President Obama in 2011, a regulation was passed saying that people could choose their own bedside partners when it comes to hospital visitation rights. And so you think now, first off, that's 9 years of us getting used to being able to say, yes, I want my best friend, I want my partner, I want my girlfriend, I want my boyfriend, whoever, to be in the hospital with me. That means before that, if you were dying and the person who took care of you for years through your cancer, or who, you know, was your partner when you had an abusive family, your abusive family can come visit. The person that you loved for months, years, decades has no rights to come be with you, maybe in your hardest moments of your life or even the final moments of your life. So I just want people watching to imagine if your partner, if, you know, uncle, auntie, if your husband or wife of 20 years is dying, and it's not just like coronavirus where everyone's prevented from seeing their loved ones, you don't get to because you're Bangladeshi or you're not a citizen. Just think about the emotional damage and impact. And then we have legal impacts as well. You know, when it also comes to not being married, when you pass away, where does your estate go? It goes to your next of kin, to your family.
Yeah.
So there have been cases where, you know, a loving same-sex couple for years that cohabitated had much more successful partnerships than some people's, you know, heterosexual opposite-sex marriages. And everything they've worked to build together because of one person's name or the other, because we've had to work around this patchwork of different laws, it just goes to, you know, perhaps the father and mother that kicked them out of the house to be homeless at age 13. Because on paper, that's family, right? But that's not, I think we've all realized in this community especially, that's not all family is, right? It's the people you choose to surround yourself with. And so this is both like a complicated legal and emotional conversation at the same time. And it's such a privilege for me to look back at this like academically, or not have to personally think about what I would have to do if my partner was, you know, dying in the hospital and I couldn't see them, but other people could. So yes, we've had that allowance since 2011, but because the president and that administration had to step in, that's just a sign of where we were before legalizing gay marriage, that was a right that people just didn't have. So when you make things more equitable and a blanket approval, you know, same-sex and opposite-sex couples have the same rights, then you don't have to navigate these very obvious injustices in retrospect.
Right.
And I mean, you cannot say you want equality for people. You can't say you don't want discrimination if you don't think that people deserve those rights specifically. Further on the emotional impact, and I kind of talked about this, if you don't get married, you can't get your taxes together, it can be very hard to start a new life as a unit. So if you're escaping an abusive household, or you know, want to shift your careers around and move somewhere else, like that kind of thing is also addressed by legal rights. And so I'm not very qualified to talk on the adoption process, but I think it's very common knowledge that, of course, same-sex couples have faced a lot of challenges. When you think about the number of children that are waiting in foster homes, I mean, they're not toys to just be handed out, but when there are loving partnerships that want to take them, and frankly, there were straight people that abused and left them there, it's very hard to rest on the morality of, oh, an opposite-sex household is superior. We have all seen that that does not preclude abuse. So the idea that it's related to whether you have mom and a dad, or a dad and a dad, or a mom and a mom in the house, you know, as we have more families being built in these less conventional but increasingly normalized structures, we're starting to see that there's not a correlation necessarily with the quality of your life. If anything, I think personally that same-sex couples have to try harder to prove themselves and kind of stand as an example, because if you know one abusive gay parent, somehow that person has to speak for all of them. But if you know somebody who abandoned their child outside a hospital and they were straight, that somehow doesn't speak for all opposite-sex couples. And we have to think about how we kind of frame that mentally, right? Why do we make minority people speak for the whole community? And as Deshi people, we can understand that too, post 9/11. We didn't speak for every Muslim extremist, right? People were conflating Sikhs and Muslims and all kinds of hatred thrown our way because we had to be the face for our community because we were others. And that's something we also need to escape. And as gay marriage is normalized, that legal framework will help us slowly get there. But there's also a cultural shift that needs to follow suit. In terms of, I know, Mo, that we talked briefly about why should same-sex marriage be legalized everywhere, and these are many of the benefits.
Mhm.
But I also want to talk maybe directly to my community here about the larger. Why should you care if you aren't gay? You don't know anybody who's gay or lesbian or bisexual, or you think you don't, and maybe you just don't care. Maybe you only care about what's happening in your community. And okay, that's your choice, but the larger example of separating church from state in a country that you emigrated to have progress for your own family, that affects you. If this country under the president, whichever president, I technically work for the government, so let's just say a president, decides to only honor Christian marriages done in a church. It doesn't matter if you have a civil union, you don't get those rights because you were not seen in the eyes of what they think is their God as a legitimate couple. I mean, the backlash that would ensue, the discrimination that we would claim, is so intense, and that's why marriage cannot be seen as entirely a religious construct. So using religious morality to say, I don't think you should legally do this because my religion says not to, that will come bite us first. So at least think of the impacts on yourself, and hopefully that will cause you to empathize with the impacts it has on people who, maybe they have no affiliation with the church. Maybe they are devout Muslims, but also homosexual. I mean, these things can coexist. And I think that when we join, as Aditi has pointed out with colonialism and as Tanya has addressed, when we join with the power structures that also keep us down as marginalized people, I mean, that's what people in power want, right? They want us infighting. They don't want us to see that we're all victims, like she said, of similar bigotries and prejudices. And that's what it is. If you want rights for yourself that you don't want for a group of other people, for a reason that doesn't affect your life, that is bigotry. And you need to maybe sit with that and understand why you think we are allowed to sit here and debate whether someone should or shouldn't have rights, right?
Yes.
As most people, these are flesh, with emotions and love and families and friends. So I just think that there's so many different ways you can approach this. You can do a legal interpretation entirely of why it should be allowed, but for me, I personally cannot separate that when I look at the struggle that we've had for the years to get, same-sex marriage on the table. That said, we still live in a world where there are people that wish it hadn't passed, and so until we are, in a post-homophobia world, I don't know if that'll ever happen, but until we don't have to start having court cases like this, we can't act like the progress is over just because people can get married. There are very many more issues affecting the community, but this is a great start. We just have to kind of keep the fight going. So that's kind of where I fall on same-sex marriage, even as a straight person. I think it's really important for us to see how it affects our community and our friends and our own selves.
That's I just have to say I'm emotional now. I think there is nothing but emotions, which can probably also for a lot of people who are so rigidly thinking a different way, they probably just have the privilege to think about themselves that way because it's so easily accessible to them without really thinking how other people are impacted. Tanya, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I mean, just going off of what Shaila said, I think this whole thing of like us versus them, and we have to remember that we are the them to a lot of other people, right? Mm-hmm. Think about it. We are not white. We're, many of us are Muslim or Hindu, right? Or even Christian, but we might be like Indian Christian, Bangladeshi Christian, right? We are not the population of this country. Like if you think about what people think about as American, right? They don't see us as American. We are different to them. So when we're doing this us versus them thing, like just keep in mind, just like Shaila said, like we could be just as easily discriminated against, and we have been, right? As we discriminate against LGBT folks because they're not us. But the truth is they are a part of our community. They exist in our community. There are people that you know or may not know about who are part of the community. And that does not take away their identity as a South Asian person, as your Bangladeshi best friend who works so much in your community or anything else, right? These things do coexist. They can coexist. And we just have to do the internal work of recognizing that their identity is no less than our identity, right? Like keeping that in mind. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're completely right about that. Like, the fact that we still divide ourselves even within like our communities into smaller pieces, it's what's it is what is, even though we're progressing so much, we're still backward. It's very important to look at other people and the way they're thinking to be even able to address these issues. And I mean, I love what you guys have raised today in different ways about, talking about how socially all of this is actually there. It's been there forever, and we've just turned a blind eye because it didn't just relate to one of us. I just loved what you guys taught, today. Thank you. Moving on, we have Samara next. Samara, you're recently graduated from college and you're working for Lados, which is a government defense contracting company. You're a program financial analyst for them and with their intelligence division. So, Samara, about 1 in 5 adults, as per research, which is around 19%, say they would be very upset if they learned that their child is a gay or a lesbian. And this is and the contrast data that I want to say around was 64%, in 1985, in a LA survey mentioned that they would be very upset if their child told them that they were gay. So I'm talking 19% very recently versus 64% in 1985. We can see definitely there is a trend where more parents are coming to accept it. But do you think still we are socially encouraged when we say, okay, you need to come out of the closet? Is that socially still encouraged, or there are still ramifications of doing that?
I think there are still plenty of ramifications of coming out of the closet. So I think that it's easier to say, like on a survey, for parents to say 1 in 5 would be very upset. But I think that when it's actually the parents dealing with that, a lot more of them tend to be very upset or have a harder time accepting it, because most parents just want to, especially in our community, they just want to think of their kids being heterosexual, gender identifying people that live these perfectly normal lives. And they don't want to have to deal with telling their friends and family that, oh, my son and daughter likes the same sex as them, because we tend to care a lot about our community and what they would think about us. So I think that it's still, I think the survey might not be fully accurate of how parents would react unless they're in that situation. Although I do still think there are plenty of parents that would support it fully. So I think that it's still very, I'm not discouraged completely, but it's very hard for people to come out and not expect some sort of social isolation based off of it, which is sad. But I think that, like in our community, like South Asian community, people think about like what your parents would say, and like growing up, you're expected to be, being like a girl, you want to look pretty, you want to be elegant, you want to be polite to all the people, and you want to marry someone who's successful and have babies with him, and get married at the right age and have a really big wedding, and you don't want to have any gossip about you. And so I think that sort of like gossip is something that a lot of people parents especially, would be scared about their kids like being the center of it. So I think that it's not as encouraged as it still should be. I think it should be something that should be very open, because I don't think it really matters like who this person wants to, go on dates with, go out with, marry, because that's not really anybody's business. But I think that a lot of people are still very scared because of it. I do have a friend who is in the South Asian community, and she came out recently. And although her parents were very accepting of it, not everyone else was. And she's kind of like socially isolated from all like the dawats and the functions, because people are like, oh, she likes girls. That's kind of weird. And it's sad that in 2020 that this girl is still facing things like that. And she feels very like insecure and unsure of going to these events, because she knows that people are going to be like asking questions like, hey, how does it work? Like, when did you decide this? And it's very uncomfortable for her, and it's not exactly their business, but it does happen. And her parents were accepting of it, but not everyone in the community was. So I think that seeing someone that goes through something like that makes it a lot harder for other people to want to come out.
Well said. Shala, you wanted to add a point to it?
Yeah, we'll touch on this maybe later if we have a discussion on allyship led by some of our friends here. But as a person in the community who has a lot of privileges, I want to say that like this lookeraki vulva stuff, this gossip that we talk about, that we somewhat think of as a little bit inherent in the Bangladeshi community. We are a chatty bunch. But there's a point where it tips over into bullying, and when you're excluding a young woman from her social community, you are a bully. I mean, auntie, there's no way around it. You know, whoever's watching this, although I think most people watching this are pretty great and open-minded, whoever you guys end up sending this to, that is what that's the damage you're doing to the young person's psyche, that they're now distanced from their community. And it's much graver, and it's you're just such a better role model if you take the step to reach out and say, yeah, I want her to come over and hang out with my daughter or son. You know, nothing will happen, right? So we trust these people as part of our community. That is says so much more about you as a person and your morals and the example you set for your kids. If you take that step when you say, hey, the way someone's being treated is wrong, I can very easily fix this at really no cost to me other than perhaps some gossip. We can weather a little bit of gossip, and we can also, until someone steps out, it's going to keep being that way. Someone has to say, hey, what you're saying is really not right. And maybe it'll work. Maybe some people are shameless. But I think being the person to take that step when you see something, I mean, not to be like a public service announcement, so see something, say something, right? Don't wait till later and say,
Yes.
oh, I'm so sorry auntie said that to you. If you can stand up within your community when you know you have a strong role and you yourself are not going to be marginalized, because of your identity.
Right.
I think that's like a really important role for us to consider in the community. If you hear a comment that's a little insulting or a little bit of a microaggression, and it's not a direct homophobic insult, but there's a little bit of condescension or implication there, it's important for us to take action on those subconscious biases and call them out when we see it, to try and kind of just wear it out in the future.
Samara, like, I just have to say, I didn't add before that we talked about a survey that is more westernized, and you talked about something so typically to the South Asian community. I'm so glad you brought that up, because I think we are still lacking that compassion that, our South Asian community has this phenomenon, and this is so true to every community. So I just wanted to say that thank you for actually putting that piece out there, that, our community is not accepting. So we're not even talking about surveys at this point. And Shaila, of course, what you added to it is definitely the thing. We can be bullies, when we don't have it our way. Anya, I think you wanted to add another point to it.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, maybe people, all of us, all 8 of us in here, or people that we know have been on the receiving end of gossip, right? You've heard something about them, or maybe, someone has said something about you and it's come back to you,
without
right?
gossip, how can it be about?
Yeah, like our community, I mean, we should be like, we should be news runners, because news spreads so fast, but, like, I'm sure everyone can identify with how isolating that felt, how crappy that felt. And, it could have been something as small as like, oh, I saw Tanya like having a drink, and it's like, oh my God, like Tanya's having a drink, she must be an alcoholic, right? It's like, no, Ma, that was just juice. Like, but like, you see how things get blown out of proportion first, and then how damaging and isolating that can be when you know people are talking about you, or when things are spreading, right? And so you don't want that for somebody else, especially if it's a friend or someone, your age, right? And I think, just like, Shaila said, like, we each have a responsibility to be that ally, right? To kind of, if your parents say something, or your family or community says something that's homophobic or transphobic, correct them. Don't just kind of, people make uncomfortable jokes, and, we talk about it all the time, and it's like, oh, that's so gay. And you should be like, no, you shouldn't say that, or this is why you shouldn't say that, right? And like a lot of other things, like Black Lives Matters and things like that, conversations can start at the dinner table. And I'm a huge like proponent of, like, you don't have to go out there and give a big speech to 1,000 people, but you could talk to your parents tonight, or you could talk to your siblings or your community. And then, like, over time, like, I've seen it work with my parents, and seen over time, the depth of our conversations changing over time. And like, I remember when Section 377 was repealed, my mom was like, I'm happy for the gays. I was like, oh, Mom. And that made me really happy. I was like, oh, like,
that's a beautiful thought.
Yeah. And like, so I've seen the progress that's been made, and there's still a lot more work to do, even within my family or community. But like, you can start small, and like if you stay silent, you are just contributing to the problem.
Right.
And so it's not enough to just be out there in your other community and be this ally if you can't be that in your own community. You have to kind of, do that. Yeah.
And and just say, when you say you start small, I think that's what it is. We should start talking about it. Like, you guys are the change makers, but at the same time, I mean, I really hope that every other person who's attending those dawats come with the same view, or at least the younger ones correct them that, so what if she is a lesbian? I'm okay to mix with her. I mean, I think she's safe for me, so you shouldn't be having a problem. So that's amazing. And even to be able to address our community in particularly about the way we all are culturally going through dawats and going through all these fun activities, but to be able to be with them and talk to them and just tell our parents if at all they think differently about this. So great going, guys, and I'm so glad we've had this conversation, but the conversation's not over yet. We will be starting off again on the open-ended questions, because I'm guessing that our viewers have had a load of questions for you, which Zarafsha will be conducting in the next few minutes. And so I just have to tell everybody, each and every one of you, thank you so much for doing this. We could go on and on, because there's just so much we have seen, and we have seen others suffering, and we have had also change of minds whenever we have dealt with someone who feels a little different from us. But I'm so proud to say that all of you panelists have had such a positive impact on like on this episode, and just glad that you guys are on board talking about it. And I'm so glad that we're not making this a difficult issue, but more of like something that is just open, ready for us to embrace, and the time is good. So thank you, guys. Coming up next is Zarafsha conducting the open-end questions. Viewers, please keep your questions coming. Our panelists are here to answer. And thank you so much for today.
No, yeah, thank you all I've been listening to this discussion, and I think every single person has made such incredible points, and it's so important to remember that this is our community, and not embracing this topic, embracing people from the LGBT community into our community, which is a lot of times the same community, is hurtful for our community, and it does hurt individuals that we once loved and we cared for. And so just because this one different aspect of their identity doesn't align with what you might feel, doesn't mean that they should be isolated, that they should be treated violently, or even in ways that you don't think is violent but can impact them, especially I think younger children. I think so I think I'm really incredibly grateful for everyone for expressing these opinions and bringing this to light and speaking so eloquently. So thank you. I think Shri and Tanya wanted to present what their organization is in a more in-depth and full manner, so people can really understand that, and also share other resources for anyone watching to educate themselves, or to help themselves go through whatever crisis they might be going through. So if you want to take it away, either of you.
Sure, you can speak a little bit. Yeah, I think so. Tanya and I, throughout our segments, I think peppered a little bit about what our organization is about, but to give it kind of in a more concrete way. So Tanya and I, along with two other folks who are also Bangali, so Bangali pride there for sure, started what's called SASMA, which stands for the South Asian Sexual and Mental Health Alliance. And so what we focus on is, as Tanya said, anything that is kind of taboo, anything that is related to identity as a South Asian American person. Mm-hmm. So, and we do focus more so on younger folks, kind of like that 13 to 30 age range, and talk about, obviously, as in the name, sexual health, mental health, and then LGBTQ issues. Those are kind of our main areas. And so what we do is we actually provide a variety of workshops, seminars, trainings. We've worked with a lot of different organizations in the past. We've presented at NABC a few times, actually, along with many other colleges, conferences, and different community organizations, including Manavi, for example, which is the domestic violence center focused for South Asian women in New Jersey. So in the workshops and seminars that we present, as well as a podcast that we have, which is called the Brown Taboo Project. And you can find that on Spotify, you can find it on Apple Podcasts, and also on our website. And then kind of the last piece of that is community building, right? So we've got, not only by coming to our workshops, not only by listening to the podcast, but also in terms of just our social media. We're very active Instagram, through Facebook. We post a lot of articles and whatnot as well. And just on our website, we have a lot of different resources on mental health, and both like general resources as well as South Asian specific resources and different organizations that we can promote, sexuality, sexual health, and then also a lot of anti-racism and anti-Blackness resources as well. So again, both kind of in the general education as well as focused on us as South Asian American young people. And we're always looking to add more to that as well. So if you ever have any interest in doing a specific workshop or training, definitely give us an email. Our website is www.susmha.org. You can find everything else through that. And we can also put that in the show notes or the description on Facebook and YouTube later. So.
Yeah. And it's, kind of like I said before, it's a great place to connect with other youth who are going through the same experiences of, growing up between two cultures and straddling both cultures and trying to kind of find their footing and their identity. And, that it's okay if you don't really know where you fit in, right? It's okay if you're going through mental health issues. If it's okay if you're, part of the LGBTQ community, but you don't know how to talk about it or express it or put it into words. And I think, especially in the last couple of months, a lot of we've put together a lot of resources and things like that, talking about anti-Blackness in our community, which is a huge, huge deal and a huge problem, right? And we are people of color. We're discriminating against other people of color, things like that. So just like we said, we have our podcast, Brown Taboo Project. Everything else is on our website and Instagram. And we've kind of lately started doing these like IGTVs where for example, we watched Never Have I Ever. We binge watched it and then we did like an analysis of it. So, we like to keep up with pop culture as well, but we're also trying always to highlight news that's not only relevant to the South Asian community, but the LGBTQ community and things like that, and just kind of keep that conversation going. So I think the Instagram is a great place if you want to actively connect with us for sure.
No, that's incredible. And like, kudos to you for like taking this great initiative and launching it. I think open conversation, as we're doing on this platform for so many weeks, is so important. I've heard so many people, not just for like, I'm seeing this episode, but for the past episodes as well, be like, thank you for like bringing this to light and like having the space to give this information, because I feel like a lot of people just don't know where to find this information, especially in relation to our community specifically. So thank you so much, really. And I think if anyone watching, wants to know more, please go ahead. You're very much encouraged to go through or look through at least their Instagram at the very least, So thank you for sharing. We're going to move into the question and answer section of this show. And so to the viewers, keep sending questions if you have any, or keep listening if that's what you feel like that's the most important, effective way for you to engage in this conversation. So the first question is from Shufra Uncle, and he asks, I think this is going to be something Shri can answer. Is there data or research on the age at which an individual begins to understand that their identity is different?
Yeah, that is an excellent question. I appreciate you asking that, as well as the follow-up to it. The short answer is, in terms of when you're looking at identity development, as any parent, right, there's kind of that piece of, as you're watching your child develop, be like, oh, okay, I expect that they would be walking by now. I expect that they're going to try their first words, and kind of wanting to keep up to see if someone is following along the typical development. And so there are kind of like general age ranges, but it's not to say that that's the only time in which that identity development can begin. So really, in terms of specifically understanding when someone starts to think, oh, I seem a little different, that actually does start as early as 3, 4, 5 years old. And that's true for race, that's true for gender, that's true for sexual orientation. So it is that time when you start to develop awareness of, kind of what you're starting to absorb what the culture and what the social norms are. And so that is, again, as I was saying before, in the same ways that we want to target these discussions on race and ethnicity, and obviously in an age appropriate way, starting to have those conversations as 3, 4, 5-year-olds and say very explicitly that, we all are loved, we all deserve love and respect, regardless of like how dark someone's skin is, or what kind of job they work, or what kind of car they drive, or all of the things, if they have kids or not, etc. In those same ways that we want those messages to start very early.
Right.
That's also true of gender and sexual orientation, of allowing, that expression of however you want to dress yourself, whatever clothes that you want to wear, or if you, whatever like you find yourself interested in, being able to help guide children, starting from that very young age. And that as that moves on in terms of conversations with a 12, 13, 14-year-old, right? And how that's going to continue to shift. And then in terms of, we're having another. So that's a good specific follow-up question. So I'd say again, different identity development models are going to have slightly different ages that are prescribed or not. And so one thing that I want to point out specifically as it relates to sexual orientation and gender identity is that there are not specific, this age is when it usually happens, because of the fact that it is much more complicated and nuanced, in that someone's sexual orientation is only going to really come to fruition as they develop, as Jack was saying earlier, those secondary sex characteristics and start to go through puberty, right? Because that's not, even though we are all as humans sexual beings from the womb, that's not necessarily until you start to have those hormonal changes, like reproduction is not necessarily on the brain in that sense. So in terms of any other identity, racial, ethnic identity as well, again, the notions start to come around 3, 4, 5. And I'd actually say Piaget is the one to credit for that, whoever asked that question. And then in terms of the cultural differences, I think, again, thinking about the influences that we have plays a huge difference, because if you are not exposed to anybody who is different, you're not going to necessarily have that prototype. You're not going to have a model at all, right? And so again, whether that's in your own family or friends, in your school, in your mosque, in your community, or in the media, like in all of those levels. So it makes a really big difference in terms of, and I'll say this, I keep comparing it to race, because I think for most of the people who are watching, that can be a place where they can access this from, because they've probably experienced something that was racist against them at some point. And so I, for example, have been in environments where someone has only ever in their life, like I'm thinking of an 8-year-old kid who had grown up in rural Georgia. And so she had only ever met white people and Black people. And she met me and she saw me and was like, I don't really think you're either, right? And so for her, she had never encountered that before. So she's like, these are the 2 boxes I know, and you don't really look white, but you don't really look Black. So what's happening here? So it's that same thing of, depending on when someone gets exposure to different things, is when they're going to start to question that, right? Or to be able to see it. And one of the things with the internet and social media today is that for kids, they do have a lot more access to community, including digital community, even if they're not necessarily seeing it in the people right in front of them, which can be a real asset as we're talking about wanting to feel kind of more included and normalized, is being able to find Susma's Instagram page and be like, oh, South Asians are gay. South Asians do care about this, right? Or any other community like forum videos, et cetera, to be able to help explore and increase their understanding of what's available out there and what fits for them.
No, yeah, really well put. Thank you for answering that question. I have like a kind of follow-up question and kind of answered this, but do you think it's like important for kids to have this exposure, this different kind of exposure in like the media, I think? Because a lot of conservative parents kind of do not want their kids to, see gay people holding hands in the street. Do not want to see, on Disney Channel, gay characters, and because they don't think it's like age appropriate for them. So, what do you think is like an like, is there like an age where like kids should be like introduced to the LGBT community? Is there like a specific age that they should be, like when they're like a teenager or something? Or is it more like it should be normalized from the very beginning? Or is there like an age appropriate way to introduce them to the community?
Yeah, there isn't. So I'll start by saying I'm not a child psychologist, but there is no one right answer. And instead, what I would say the right answer is that there is a different right answer for every age. And it should be something that's discussed throughout somebody's life. And again, obviously, what you'd say to like a 4 or 5-year-old may be more like, oh yeah, like Michael has 2 moms and they love each other just like you and like my mom and like your mom and myself love each other, etc. Right? So just kind of equalizing it in that way, and that's going to look very different from that conversation at 14, 15, 16. I think in terms of folks kind of having that idea of like, oh, ও যদি ওর সাথে কোনো সময় ওরা যদি একসঙ্গে কিছু করে, then maybe they'll like start to get bad ideas. That's just false, in the sense that you do not suddenly get the idea to be gay. You have to remember that being queer and being trans is incredibly difficult, and not because of any inherent differences, but because of the societal and cultural expectations. So much mental impact that has, and all the things we've talked about in terms of stigmatization and taboos and discrimination. Nobody chooses to be gay. Nobody chooses to be trans. It's hard, and I can tell you lots of hard stories that I have in my personal life of what got me to this point of where I am very comfortable being very open and upfront about myself. But I'm 26. It took a very long time to get to where we are now. And I think having those examples throughout would have been a different story. I didn't know anyone else who was South Asian and who was an out queer. And that's part of my mission, is to be that for other folks, and to have folks be able to reach out. But there's certainly no age at which it's like a bad exposure, because all that it's going to teach a kid is to love. And that is what ultimately all of our faiths preach, is to love, right? And to see the humanity in one another. So that's all you're teaching. You're not teaching them like bad ideas. You're teaching them how to love your neighbor.
Exactly. And I don't think it's not like we don't talk about love with kids, even from a young age. It's just that it's very heterosexual, which is, I think, a different like problem. But it's not like kids don't know what love is when they're like whatever age that they do. It's just they only know one way, which isn't very conducive to anyone. So thank you, and I really appreciate what you're saying about being there for other people, because I think going through that experience can be very hard and traumatic, and we don't want anyone to be suffering that way. So like I hope it gets better for everyone. So I think Farhana wanted to say something.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, I don't even know why it should be a problem for kids and what time they should start knowing this, because just as simple as, in the community they're brought in, we do have brown, black, white people, and the kids just, continue to deal with all of this without really understanding that they don't think that there's a difference between these people. They can have like a, I don't want to I want to just sound racist, but like you can have a black friend and a white friend, and it is completely okay to have it. because that's what the community is. We're in a melting pot community. We just know these people. So when it comes to this group of people, why should it be that there should be an appropriate age for them? I mean, if each of us already understand that these are just different people and we identify differently, just the way we identify that we are brown in the community and someone else is white in the community, I don't even think we would have to come to a point that we would try to understand is this kid different from this kid, and how, or how they look at other people differently. So just saying that they're all, I mean, if we normalized this, if we already knew just love is the subject, and there is no reason that, same-sex gay marriages can't happen, there is no reason why it should be just heterosexual. If we don't discuss that, I don't even think that there is an inappropriate age for anyone to learn something. It would just be the same thing for everyone. I mean, and the other thing is we need to start telling people that, something that Sri said before, it's not a different, like, it's a difference between nurture and nature. So if we can make nurture say that this is nature, and some people have not chose, but they are who they are and they feel differently, I don't even think, it's just nature. So I guess kids will also be able to look at it in the same way, that, yeah, we're different, but, we're the same people, and we have the ability to love each other. So yeah, I just don't know if there's an age appropriate, but I do think we need to start telling kids that it's not about a boy and a girl. It can be, love is love.
Yeah, because that's what it is at the end of the day. It's especially for a younger child, it's just love. I think people have this conception that it's like this like heavily like sexual thing, which it can be, but it doesn't always have to be. So I think Shyla wanted to have like a follow-up question, and then we can ask this question. Oh, follow-up comment, and then we can answer the next question.
I'll keep it quick because it's pretty redundant to what these two ladies have said, that, when you see a mother and a father in Cartoon Network, it's not sexual. They are the parents in that household. This doesn't invite further questions on their relationship other than that's what a family looks like. So when people argue that having two dads or two moms in a children's show, I don't care if the kid is 2 or 4 or 12. There's no inappropriateness showing two people in a partnership. And I think you guys have touched on
that. So yeah. Thank you. I think we're iterating that problem. So on the same line as like the previous question, someone asks, one of the biggest questions is how much of same-sex preferences are biological, like is it predetermined when one is born, versus how much is consequential, like being influenced by others. I think many worry that it is the latter. And how do we address this if it's not? Is there any science behind this topic? I think someone talked about this, touched on this before, but if someone wants to reiterate, Shri or
Yeah, I can speak to this a bit. I'm sure others on the panel can as well. So the chromosome question is an interesting one. So as Jack pointed out, right at the top of the show, talking about biological sex and specifically sex assigned at birth, as opposed to gender, and how those are two different things. The way gender is how one identifies oneself internally as well as expresses that societally and culturally, versus a biological sex is something that is often assigned just by external genitalia, but there are so many other things related to what someone's sex is, obviously, as you said, including chromosomes. So in this question, I actually think, it's common to think like XX is female and XY is male, right? But there are so many other things that actually go into our biological sex. And so there's actually, when you think about the condition of intersex, which is someone who, for some reason, has some sort of ambiguous sex, and that can be, again, because of either external and or internal characteristics. I teach a sexuality and relationships class to undergrads, and one of the things that I love to share is that there are over 100 different ways to be intersex. And that is not at all just related to your external genitalia. And in fact, many people, because we don't necessarily have, our chromosome, like we don't get genetic testing done just willy-nilly, but actually many people are intersex and don't even know it. And the prevalence rate is about 1 to 2% of the population, which is just as common as being redheaded. One of my favorite fun facts. So people think that this is like a super, it's a less common thing than it actually is. I bet you probably know a redhead in your life, so that actually probably means you know somebody who is also intersex in your life, whether they know it or not, because of all of the different variations that occur. And obviously with such amazing complex genomes, there's gonna be subtle variations. And I can also actually recommend some excellent podcasts that talk about this and really break it down in terms of not just humans, but all other animals as well, right? Because we can learn a lot from those comparisons and other genetic sequencing that we've done around, what people like to think of as really clear male female is not clear at all. And so it only makes sense that gender would also follow along those same lines of not, we want to think it's just easier to be like, you have box 0 or 1 and that's it, but that's actually not the reality of how it is.
And this mindset actually, can be very harmful, I think, like medically speaking. I've read about how at birth, doctors, they kind of, when they assign sex, even if you are intersex, you are always oftentimes, I don't know if it's as prevalent today, but you are still assigned like either male or female. And if your genitalia doesn't like align with what the doctor or like with all the characteristics don't line up, you are given like, medically, you're
forced into surgery often.
Yeah, surgery, that's what I was trying to explain that. And that, as a baby, as a child, that can be traumatic, and you might even not even know about it until you're like way older, but you might have that, either physical or mental like trauma of that surgery. And I think even though it's like you were just born that way, completely natural, completely, biologically, if that's the argument you're making, but still this mindset of like this binary gender system kind of, creates like this trauma that like doesn't seem necessary in order to like perpetrate this idea that there's only male and female biologically, there's only 2 genders, when that's not true, to keep that in place. So I think even that is just like understanding that can, ease other people's pain. So thank you for bringing up this question and also for answering this. I think Shyla wanted to follow up, but she probably
I think Tanya. I just wanted to throw one thing out there too, as we're talking about not just this chromosomal conversation, but then also we've had a few other questions in the chat regarding sexual orientation along those same lines of like how much nurture versus nature. The answer is there's no clear percentages. It would be great, again, if we could be like, oh, it's like 60% nature and 40% nurture. That we don't know that to that degree, but again, there are a lot of biological genetic components, and there are also a lot of social cultural components. So as somebody pointed out in the comments, that biopsychosocial thing comes into play, whether we're talking about gender, sex, or sexual orientation.
And I think one of the things is like, so I think, and Sri, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think a study has found there is no gay gene, for example. So there is no actual genetic random gene called like gay 1, right? That makes you homosexual or makes you trans or anything like that. So, but then I think some people will use that to argue like, oh, so then how can you say that you were born this way, right? But again, just like we said, it's not just biological, it's also psychosocial and how you're raised and everything like that. So, and the other thing I think I like to point out when I do tons of like LGBTQ 101 trainings at work, right? And we go through a lot of the things that Jack talked about, right? In terms of, differences between sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity and things like that. And I like to point out that in the animal kingdom, there's homosexuality. And I think a lot of people are like, what? I'm like, yes, there are, animals that there are, I think orangutans are one of them, lions, penguins, definitely. There are tons of gay penguins who raise children in a most loving way. So I think this inherent thing of like biology is sometimes tied to reproduction, right? Like, because in order to create a child, you need to have sperm and an egg, and therefore that has to come from male and female and all this stuff. So I think it's just those arguments, I think, just start to become moot after a while, and people are like, oh my God, why isn't there like a gene if you say you're born this way? And then just like Sri pointed out, and I did read in an article, and this was some time ago, don't quote me on it, but there are like 16 different actual chromosomal variations that can categorize you as intersex. So just like Sri said, we may know people that are intersex, but you won't, even they might not know it. And for a lot of people, they don't ever find out because, again, everything is functioning normally for some people. They may have fertility issues when they're trying to get pregnant. Maybe that's when it comes up. For some people, it actually comes up when they die and they have they won't know, but like their family might find out when they have an autopsy and, they're opened up and you're like, wait a minute, these organs don't match up to, what we thought were supposed to be in here, right? So, yeah, I think so this argument that like, your biology is it, like there is, you should not, your gender identity cannot be different from your biology. It's like, no, but your biology isn't even the two boxes that we think about it as they are. There's more boxes. And that makes people uncomfortable.
Yeah. It is very hard. It's a complex system. And for a lot of people, it's like, really overwhelming. I think children especially, they really love categorizing everything, and that's how they develop. And so it's hard to kind of unlearn that, like the strict categorizations that we've been conditioned to, because that's just how we like to analyze and like process the world. But we're very complex beings. So I think it's important to understand that we are complex and that we can process that there's like nothing. So I think Shyla wanted to make a comment as well.
Yeah, quick comment. I think science and data is always like the best baseline to work from, especially because that's kind of what you'll be attacked with. But I think also for some of our viewers, anecdote and perspective when you're not as scientifically entrenched can be helpful. And for those of you that maybe don't know a lot of queer people, whether it's you don't know any trans people or maybe one gay person and it's because they were you think maybe they were raised a certain way. I can say that anecdotally, and I'm sure many of my friends here can confirm this, that I know people raised in oppressively, backwards, kind of anti-progressive, theocratic type of households. I know people raised, by parents who were very open and progressive and hippies. I know all people in between. And whether it comes to gender identity or sexual orientation, you can turn out any way. I mean, whether you want to parse how much of it is nature versus nurture, I think that, kind of underpinning the science underpins this, but we have even seen that people are not raising their kids in a gay way or something like that, right? There's not such a thing, and there's really no evidence for that. So I would say that's probably just like a little bit of fear mongering that if you could have done something different, your kid wouldn't have been gay or you wouldn't have been trans. And I think that's just, there's no either scientific or socially experienced basis to really justify that. So something to keep in mind.
Yeah, thank you. Exactly. I think that's a really good point, that it just, it isn't a choice. It isn't a, something that directly influenced you and you were like, oh, this is why I'm gay. And so someone else asked a question that we frequently hear the stigma that same-sex promotes diseases like HIV and AIDS. Is this a fact or another fiction against same-sex relationships? So,
yeah, so I can definitely speak to that. This is my work. So first of all, the answer is no, it does not promote or, in a nutshell, does not create more rates of, HIV or any other sexually transmitted infections like gonorrhea, chlamydia, syphilis, that kind of thing. Now, when you are looking at HIV does not, just like anything else in the world, right, is not like a standalone thing, right? So the risk of someone getting HIV is not just influenced by what kind of sex they're having, right? And, whether it's, a man having sex with other men or whatever, it's also influenced by what we like to call the social determinants of health, right? So you've got, your access to healthcare, what kind of zip code are you living in, right? And who you're having sex with. If you live in an area, for example, if you live in DC where we have a very small space and you are tightly packed with people, right? And the rate of HIV is high and people get freaked out. But I'm like, think about it. It's a city. It's a small area with a lot of people packed in. If you live in a zip code where more people have HIV, you're more likely to get HIV, right? Because you're probably having sex with someone in your community or in your neighborhood, right? So think about that. So that is like probability in mathematics, when you're thinking about that. And then you have access, you have racism, you have classism, you have access to healthcare, prevention, education. So, and I could speak about this for literally years, but I will try to keep it tight. But HIV doesn't exist in a vacuum, and the risk of HIV. We think about, when I'm teaching epidemiology, we talk about the different race breakdowns. For an African American gay man, the risk of getting HIV is 1 in 2. Versus for a white man, it is much, much, much less, like 1 in 50 or something like that. And they're still high numbers, but 1 in 2 is a 50% chance in your lifetime that you will get HIV. And right then you can see like the racial differences, right? And the differences between access that maybe a white gay man has versus a Black gay man has. And then we know about Black Lives Matters, all the things that are happening. So there are so many different things that are taking place. One thing I will say, when it comes to the pure physiological things in your body, yes, and I'm being kind of explicit, and I hope it doesn't like scare anybody, but if it's a man having sex with another man, your the way your body is designed and the way that your body, there is a more prone to tears and things like that. So biologically, yes, there is maybe a little bit more risk, and that's why we encourage condoms. We encourage protection, pre-exposure prophylaxis, which is a pill you can take once a day, which can prevent your chances of getting HIV by over 90%, right? But it's not, this myth of like, is it spreading diseases is incorrect in its most basic sense. You have to look at all the other things that are in play, and then dissect, okay, where, and this is like health disparity, right? This is what we're talking about, and then dissect how do those things interact with HIV and someone's risk of getting HIV or spreading HIV. And then you think about the stigma around HIV, right? So maybe you're having sex with someone and you can't tell them that you have it because people do face violence and death often because it's so stigmatized. Even if you're on treatment, even if you are doing really well and you're healthy. And we know that if you take your HIV medication regularly and your viral load is very low, your chance of passing it on is almost negligible. What we call undetectable equals untransmittable, U equals U. So I will stop now, but the answer is no.
No. And like, I mean, you can also get an STI from like, a heterosexual, like sexual
Absolutely.
encounter.
That's in sharing a glass with a friend, right?
Yeah.
Different ways that can happen. That has happened to me with sex.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, the important thing is to have safe sex is what it is. So thank you. Another question came up about how do you think we can overcome the dilemma between religion and sexual orientation? I think like we talked a little bit about this earlier about how people have religious concerns. They say like, oh, the Bible says homosexuality is bad, or the Quran says homosexuality is bad. And how do you contend with that? Or a lot of people say you can't be Muslim or you can't be Christian and be gay, which is that, what do you guys say to that?
I don't want to speak for anybody else, but the way that I personally have been dealing with it and kind of grappling is questioning everything. And I know it's really annoying to my parents because I'm always like, why do we have to do that? Why? And growing up in a Brahmin household, right, where we have, pretty strict rules around pujo and things like that, right? For example, if you're on your period, you can't be near the thakur, you can't do pujo or do certain things, or like something I heard the other day is like achar. If you're making achar, it's very like sacred and clean, and like you can't. There's rules around achar that I did not know existed. But I'm always like, why is that? And I know it's annoying when I question like this, but I'm like, okay, there's a rule. You're telling me there's a rule, right, that I have to follow, but like, can you tell me the logic behind it? Can you tell me the science behind it? Like, then because I'm a very scientific mind. So if you can't explain the logic, then I'm not following your rule. So that's how I kind of deal with it in terms of like, and I think it's helped me kind of have conversations with my parents and to break some ground and think like, why do you think this way? Why is this particular rule that you're following? Have you ever thought about why you're following it, or why you're just doing what like some other mashi told you. Have you ever questioned why they're saying this? And also when it comes to religion, right, it's up to interpretation, right? And I'm like, I don't think, Taku directly called you and said, please don't do this. These are things that have been put into place by human beings over time because of interpretation. So, yeah.
No, exactly. I think our culture really relies a lot on like, oh, this is what has been done, that's why we should be doing this. But I think it really doesn't benefit anyone, especially ourselves and our community, if we don't ask questions how to, keep our culture and our community, safe. And so Aditi, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, just really quick, wanted to go off what Tanya was saying. Like, in my opinion, religion is something that is man-made. So when we're talking about a lot of these fears and stigmas in our religious communities, it's more so the community that drives a lot of this fear or these fears versus the religion itself. Speaking on Islam specifically, like I feel like more people in the LGBT community experience like a don't ask, don't tell sort of environment. But Islam is a very accepting religion, and its foundations are based on peace and befriending and supporting each other. So when people use religion as a way to discriminate against the LGBT community, it doesn't make sense to me, because at the core of what we all do is, at the core of each religion essentially is humanity and is love. So.
No, absolutely. I think that's why we're here today, to make sure our community is, stays loving, stays peaceful, and just not talking about it is not doing anyone any good. And so thank you for bringing that point up, that it is, at the end of the day, we can't practice peace. We can't preach for like having peace and love and community and not actually practice it. So thank you for bringing that up. So I think one last question, and if no one can exactly answer this, that's fine too, is, does Darwinism support homosexuality in animals? I think this is a very scientific question, and I don't know if anyone is going to have the answer to this.
I do have an answer to that. But I wanted to say first, Mo, did you want to say something? I think for a previous point, there was something you wanted to add.
Oh, yeah, I think I was going to say what Aditi was saying, really chime in with her, that, our religion is what makes us follow what is right and wrong. And these people in full flesh, when we talk about LGBTQ, they are in full flesh. They're real people with real dreams and visions. And I just don't understand that, the same religion that teaches us to be loving towards each other, to actually maintain peace, can actually differentiate another group of people to say that they're the wrong people in the world, where I don't even think we actually can decide. We just need to accept what we see. So even if it's not drastically and very, very explicitly mentioned anywhere, I still think that they are people and they have their rights. And it is for each of us, what we have been told even by religion, is to, accept people the way they are, be less judgmental has to be one of the things that is explicitly mentioned in, probably in Quran, and I'm sure in the other books as well. So if we are less judgmental, I think we all can get together. So just, really reinstating on the point that Aditi made, I don't know why we're judging other people because apparently they're wrong by a certain, just because they're not explicitly mentioned in another book.
No, exactly. I think judgment and being so judgmental about things that don't really concern you shouldn't, be so prevalent in your community. I think Shri wanted to answer the other question.
Yeah, I can speak to that briefly. Darwinism, so in terms of thinking about, as Tanya mentioned, a variety of so many other animals and so many other species that engage in any kind of same-sex sexual behavior. And so that is incredibly common across all sorts of different genuses and species. And there's actually a lot of really interesting theories around how and why humans adapted to be homosexual. Like why, coming from this evolutionary perspective, if we know that you require, in order to form a zygote, you require a male partner and a female partner, why would homosexuality exist, right? That's what some people think of. So, and there's a lot of reasons to that, including thinking about how we developed in tribes and small communities, and the way that social support is such a critical part to successfully bring up a child. And so actually there are some theories around how you can, thinking about kind of being like the gay uncle, you can provide more resources and support within a kinship circle, within a family, within a community, by being homosexual, because you're actually helping to increase the number of resources in terms of hunting and gathering and like what we are providing to that child, without necessarily also increasing the number of children that are happening. So there's actually a lot of different theories around why homosexuality has developed in a variety of different animals, as well as in us as human animals. But again, thinking about the fact that there are humans, along with many other species, again, do not only have sex for reproduction, we also have sex for connection, right? For intimacy, for pleasure, the same way that a hug feels really good and is important. And, so thinking about all of those other factors, it makes a lot of sense why same-sex sexual behavior and same-sex sexual attraction is not necessarily this foreign or unique thing, whether we're talking about culture or just to us as a species.
Mm-hmm. No, yeah, thank you. The points you made are extremely, I think, helpful for centering this conversation, that it is, it's not just always about reproduction, even though we really want to believe, even though evolution is not always just about that. So thank you. I think Samara wanted to make a comment as well.
Yeah, so like I understand that Darwinism does focus on like natural selection, survival of the fittest, and like it's and I've like heard that argument before, that it's not like human nature because it's about reproduction, and that's like the main goal is to like create a species that survives, and that's how animals do it. But I think that's like what makes us humans, is that we have a higher level of thinking, and the fact that we don't need to reproduce in a male and female way. There's so many other ways to like start families without man and female intercourse. And I think that's like what separates us from a lot of Darwin studies, is that animals did do that to survive, to like meet their basic needs. But we're humans, we have our basic needs met, and we have the ability to enjoy a lot of other things like sex for pleasure, and not just for the sake of reproduction.
No, absolutely. Thank you. I think those are great points and a great wrap-up point for this discussion. Thank you, everyone, for this discussion, and for your incredible points, and for bringing up so many different perspectives and kind of, stimulating this discussion. I want to ask just one short last question. I think we've all heard how to like what LGBT is and what the community is, and what people, all of this like a lot of scientific and even like cultural ways to interact. I want to ask people on this panel, how, now that we know this information, how do we support this community? Now that we know this community is, valid, and this community should be supported, how do we do that? How do we go about being an ally? I know someone talked about this for a brief second, but if we want to like go on a little more, elaborate on that a little more, so that people can take this in and also, put this into action.
So to kick that off, I think the number one way to support LGBTQ people is to ask LGBTQ people what they need support in, right? So as with being allied in any way, the point of an ally is to listen to the people who have that marginalized identity and who have that experience, and to support them with whatever it is that they say they need. That being said, you don't always have to stop and be like, oh, Sri, or like, oh, Bhaya, would you like, how do you want me to proceed? Because it can also be exhausting to have to always tell other people, this is what needs to be done. So as has been said before, there are so many different spheres that we exist in, including, the thoughts and comments going on in our own head, conversations at the dinner table, when you're at the mosque, when you're at the temple, when you're at a dawat, when you're at an emontono, whatever it might be, right? In all of those spaces, at school, at work, there are ways to constantly be allied, and that is a verb, based on the actions that you're taking. So it means constantly, that you can't, just because you have the privilege of blending in or not saying something in a moment, it means instead being courageous, trying to be brave. And even if you don't have the perfect words, to say to someone, hey, that's hurtful, that's offensive, or let me share a resource with you that might help expand their mind a little bit, or sending them a link to this discussion, for example, or so many other resources that exist. So the biggest thing is to listen to people who are actually in the community, tell you what they need, and there's so many resources on that. But B, you have to also understand that you are going to have access to spaces that queer or trans people will never have access to. Things will be said around you as a straight person or a cis person that will never be said around the person who is LGBTQ. So when you're in those environments, you have to take the step outside of your comfort zone, do something that's a little risky, and say something.
So education. You need to educate people.
And I don't know if anyone else who is allied wanted to speak to that as well, of any experiences that they've had or any tips for being a straight cis ally.
No, I think someone already mentioned this, but kind of confronting the people in your general sphere, in your direct sphere. If someone says something homophobic, transphobic, straight up be like, no, that's wrong. And now that you know why that's wrong, maybe you don't even need to be have the perfect answer, the perfect scientific research backed up answer, but as long as you can be like, that's just harmful to this community of people that are human, that are almost always also part of our community, that's the first step you can take, being that person that confronts these ideals around you. But yeah, if anyone else has any other input, not we can wrap up. But thank you again to everyone.
Yeah, this is excellent. Thank you so much. Such a thought-provoking and such an intellectual discussion, and I'm so proud of each and every one of you. Samara, Sri, Tanya, Aditi, Jack, Shaila, you guys are amazing. Seriously, you're the next leaders, and you will have our support all the way. And so will the community. I mean, we're coming out in a big way, and now we're learning. So this is great. We're moving to the right direction, and there is hope. And you'll rock the world. So excellent session. Thank you, Farhana and Zarafsha, for conducting the program so well. So before we all adjourn, we're going to end with a little slideshow of all of you. And with that, for next week, we're going to talk about, are we doing the right thing by opening up the schools and the universities? It's a very important dilemma that we're trying to deal with. Like, my daughter is super excited to move into a dorm with her roommate. She can't wait, but is it really safe, So do we follow the blended model, or we should close everything down and do that online, or we should do 100% in person? So there's a lot of discussion to be had with you guys. So the parents, please bring your kids to talk about that. And thank you again. This is a fantastic show. It's one of my favorites. And I really, like to congratulate you for such a great discussion. And with that, talk to you all and have a great weekend. And we'll see you all next week, next Saturday, the same time, 12 noon Eastern. And thank you again. Take care, you all.